The day began like any other, a serene morning filled with the scent of coffee and the hum of life. James, a 38-year-old architect, had married Sarah a decade earlier. Their life appeared picturesque. A suburban home, family dinners, shared vacations, and countless memories etched into the walls of their lives. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. James' younger brother, Nathan, had recently moved to the same city for a new job. Nathan was charismatic, quick with jokes, and had always shared a strong bond with James. Sarah welcomed Nathan warmly, and soon, he became a regular guest at their home. For James, having Nathan nearby brought a sense of comfort and nostalgia. They had weathered their fair share of storms growing up and had always leaned on each other. He didn't notice the subtle changes in Sarah's demeanor when Nathan was around. The longer-than-usual laughter at his jokes, the casual but lingering touches, or the way she would suddenly seem distant after he left. As weeks turned to months, James was consumed by work. He often stayed late at the office, a growing architectural project demanding his attention. Nathan filled the void during James' absence, helping Sarah with small errands, offering companionship, and bringing his unique charm to the household. Sarah assured James that it was harmless. After all, wasn't Nathan family? James didn't question her. He trusted her implicitly, confident that the bond they shared was unbreakable. Yet, something unspoken lingered in the air, something James could not name. The summer months were bustling with life, and the trio, James, Sarah, and Nathan, seemed inseparable. Nathan had woven himself into the fabric of their home, becoming almost a fixture at their dinners and weekend outings. James, unaware of the undercurrent beneath their interactions, cherished having his brother close. One Friday evening, Sarah hosted a small barbecue. Friends and neighbors milled about the backyard, drinks in hand, laughter mingling with the smoky aroma of grilled food. Nathan was at the grill, Sarah standing close by, her laughter ringing out at something he said. James watched from afar, a smile tugging at his lips. He admired their camaraderie, chalking up their ease to Nathan's knack for connecting with people. Still, a small voice in the back of his mind noted how often they stood side by side, heads tilted together as though sharing secrets. It wasn't jealousy, James prided himself on his trust, but curiosity. Later that evening, while clearing the dishes, James noticed Sarah's phone buzz with a message. Glancing at the screen, he saw it was from Nathan. "Can't wait for Sunday." James frowned but quickly dismissed it. He assumed it was about their plan to catch a baseball game, something Nathan had mentioned casually a few days earlier. His thoughts didn't linger. But Sunday came and went, and the game never happened. Nathan didn't show up. Sarah was unusually quiet that day, claiming she wasn't feeling well, and James didn't press her. The following week, James found himself increasingly distracted. He chalked it up to stress from work, but in truth, it was something else, a nagging feeling he couldn't quite place, a faint crackle in the atmosphere of his home. James buried himself in work during the following days, often returning home late. He trusted Sarah implicitly, never suspecting anything beyond the ordinary. Meanwhile, Nathan's absence was only sporadic. He still joined for family dinners, or an occasional weekend outing, but something about his demeanor had shifted. One Friday night, James received a call from his boss, asking for a last-minute meeting to finalize a proposal. With an apologetic smile, he explained to Sarah that he'd be late again. "Don't worry," Sarah replied, brushing it off. "Nathan said he might stop by to help fix the squeaky back door. I'll have company." James was grateful. His brother's willingness to pitch in always eased his guilt about being away so often. He left for work, unaware of the stirrings within his own walls. That evening, as James pored over blueprints in his office, a light drizzle began falling outside. He remembered the creaky back door Nathan promised to fix. A faint smile crossed his face as he imagined his brother tinkering away with his toolbox, maybe exchanging playful banter with Sarah. Hours later, he arrived home to find the house quiet. The back door no longer squeaked when he entered. "Looks like Nathan took care of it," James thought to himself, feeling a pang of gratitude. He found Sarah curled up on the couch with a blanket, engrossed in a novel. She looked up, smiled warmly, and asked, "Long night?" "Yeah," James sighed, leaning in for a kiss. "Nathan came by?" She nodded, her face calm and composed. He fixed the door and stayed for a bit. We chatted, but he didn't stay too late. It was the perfect alibi. James never questioned it. And why would he? They were family. Weeks passed, and life continued its steady rhythm. James was engrossed in his architectural project, often working late. Sarah maintained her usual routines, but small, almost imperceptible changes began to surface. She seemed distracted at times, her phone constantly within reach. When James entered a room, she would quickly lock her screen or angle it away. On the rare occasions they spent the evening together, her laughter felt forced, her responses distant. Nathan, too, was behaving differently. He stopped dropping by as frequently, his once boisterous personality subdued when he did. James chalked it up to the pressures of Nathan's new job, reminding himself that everyone had their own battles. Still, something gnawed at James. It wasn't suspicion. It felt more like an itch he couldn't scratch, a slight imbalance in the atmosphere of his home. Sarah had been particularly insistent about hosting Nathan's birthday dinner the following weekend, an idea James supported wholeheartedly. It was a chance to rekindle the closeness they all once shared. The night of the dinner, Sarah seemed unusually vibrant. She wore a dress James hadn't seen in months, her makeup applied with meticulous care. "You look stunning," he told her, and she smiled. But the warmth in her eyes didn't quite reach him. Nathan arrived, his usual charm dialed up a notch. As the night unfolded, James noticed the small glances exchanged between his wife and brother, the subtle lean toward each other during conversations. It was all so casual, so innocent on the surface, but something about it set James on edge. Later, while clearing the table, James overheard snippets of their conversation, whispers and laughter that ceased abruptly as he entered the room. Sarah turned to him with an easy smile, but for the first time, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. The cracks were beginning to show. The morning after Nathan's birthday dinner, James woke up feeling restless. The unease from the night before lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Sarah was already in the kitchen, her cheerful demeanor slightly forced as she prepared breakfast. "Last night was nice," James said, testing the waters. "It was," she replied with a quick smile, not meeting his eyes. "Nathan seemed to enjoy himself." James nodded, watching her closely. "Yeah, it was good to see him relax. He's been so busy with work lately." "Exactly," Sarah said, her tone light but her body tense. "He deserves a little fun." The words didn't sit right with James, though he couldn't articulate why. He shrugged it off and tried to focus on his day, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That evening, as Sarah went to bed early claiming a headache, James found himself scrolling through photos from the dinner on his phone. He stopped at one. A candid shot of Sarah and Nathan laughing together, their heads tilted toward one another. It should have been a heartwarming image, but something about it felt off. James couldn't pinpoint the source of his discomfort, but it lingered. The closeness, the familiarity, it was almost too natural. The next week, James noticed other small oddities. Sarah began taking longer to get ready, even on days when they had no plans. Her phone, once left casually on the counter, was now constantly with her, its notifications silenced. Nathan called earlier, James mentioned one evening, watching for her reaction. "Oh," she said, her tone overly casual. "What did he say?" "Just checking in. He said he'd been meaning to call you too." Her response was a faint smile. "I'll text him later." James didn't press further, but his instincts told him that something was shifting, something he couldn't ignore. The bond he thought he shared with Sarah felt increasingly tenuous, and though he couldn't yet articulate his fears, he began to feel like an outsider in his own home. The unraveling had begun. James couldn't shake the sense of unease that clung to him in the days that followed. Every interaction between Sarah and Nathan replayed in his mind, each one scrutinized for meaning. Was he imagining things? Or was there truly something deeper lurking beneath the surface? One evening, after another long day at work, James decided to try and reconnect with Sarah. He suggested they watch a movie together, something lighthearted to break the growing tension. She hesitated but eventually agreed, sitting beside him on the couch. Her phone buzzed midway through the movie, and though she glanced at it quickly, she didn't reply. Still, James couldn't help but notice her body stiffen ever so slightly. "Everything okay?" he asked casually. "Yeah, just a message from work," she replied with a thin smile. James didn't press her, but the response felt rehearsed. Later that night, while Sarah was in the shower, James sat in the living room, staring at her phone on the coffee table. He had never been the type to snoop, but his curiosity was overpowering. He reached for it, but stopped himself, his hand hovering over the screen. What was he even looking for? Evidence? Reassurance? The idea of violating her privacy left a bitter taste in his mouth, and he pulled his hand back. Instead, he went to bed, lying awake as Sarah's even breathing filled the room. He told himself he was overthinking, that the bond they had built over the years was too strong to be broken by fleeting doubts. But in the quiet hours of the night, unanswered questions echoed in his mind. Why did Nathan's presence seem to linger even when he wasn't there? Why had Sarah grown so distant, yet so guarded? And most importantly, why did James feel like the foundation of his life was slowly shifting beneath his feet? He couldn't know it yet, but these questions would soon demand answers. The following weekend, James decided to take a rare day off from work. He planned a surprise for Sarah, a picnic at the park where they had their first date. It was a gesture to rekindle the warmth they once shared. Sarah seemed genuinely touched when he told her about the plan, but her hesitation didn't escape him. "That sounds lovely," she said, forcing a smile. "But I promised my mom I'd visit her today. Rain check?" James nodded, though disappointment simmered beneath the surface. Of course. Family first. Later that afternoon, feeling restless, James decided to run a few errands. On his way back, he stopped at a local cafe to grab a coffee. As he stepped inside, a familiar voice caught his attention. Glancing toward the far corner, he saw Sarah sitting at a small table by the window, not with her mother, but with Nathan. James froze, watching as they leaned toward each other, their heads close, sharing a quiet conversation. It looked intimate, conspiratorial. He told himself it was innocent. They were family, after all. But the seed of doubt planted weeks ago had begun to grow, its roots twisting through his thoughts. He considered walking over to greet them, but decided against it. Instead, he slipped back out the door, his coffee forgotten. When Sarah returned home later, James acted as though nothing had happened. "How was your mom?" he asked casually. "She's doing well," Sarah replied, her voice light. "We had a good talk." Her answer was too smooth, too perfect. James smiled and nodded, but inside, his trust wavered. For the first time in their marriage, he felt like a stranger in his own life, unsure of the truth behind Sarah's words. The encounter at the cafe weighed heavily on his mind, pulling at the delicate threads of his marriage. Something wasn't right, and James knew it was only a matter of time before the truth revealed itself. James couldn't let the image of Sarah and Nathan at the cafe slip from his mind. That night, as he lay beside her, the familiar comfort of their shared space felt strangely hollow. Her easy breathing, the rhythm he once found soothing, now carried an edge of unease. The next morning, James decided to address the growing tension indirectly. Over breakfast, he brought up Nathan. "I ran into him the other day. He seems to be settling in well here, doesn't he?" Sarah paused for a moment, a flicker of something unspoken crossing her face before she replied. "Yeah, he seems happy. I think he's enjoying being close to family again. Did you get a chance to see him recently?" James asked, his tone casual. She nodded, sipping her coffee. "He stopped by to help me move some boxes in the garage. I didn't want to bother you since you've been so busy." James smiled faintly, though his chest tightened. The lie was subtle, but it was there. Nathan hadn't mentioned the garage when they were at the cafe. James could have called her out, but something held him back. Instead, he let the conversation flow back to safer topics, filing her response away for later. That day, he made a quiet decision. He would find out the truth. It wasn't just about Sarah's behavior anymore. It was about protecting the life they had built together. If something was unraveling, James needed to face it head-on. The question was, how far was he willing to go to uncover what lay beneath the surface? James decided he couldn't live in the shadows of doubt any longer. That evening, while Sarah was out running errands, he began his search for clarity. It started with something simple, her phone. It wasn't locked, a detail that gave James a pang of guilt. He wasn't proud of this intrusion, but the weight of unanswered questions pushed him forward. He scrolled through her messages and emails, finding nothing out of the ordinary. If there was something to uncover, Sarah had hidden it well. But as he searched further, James stumbled upon a folder of photos tucked away in her cloud storage. Among snapshots of family vacations and everyday moments were several recent pictures of Sarah and Nathan, too many to be casual. One stood out. Nathan standing behind Sarah in their living room, his hands on her shoulders, their smiles close and intimate. James' heart sank. These weren't just family photos. When Sarah returned home, he confronted her. "How was your day?" he asked, his voice steady but his mind racing. "Busy," she replied, setting her bag on the counter. "Yours?" James hesitated, debating whether to dive into the confrontation now or wait. His hands trembled, his emotions a storm waiting to break. Finally, he opted for subtlety. "I was looking through some old photos today. Found a few of you and Nathan. You two are close, huh?" Sarah froze, the question hanging heavily between them. "Of course," she said after a moment, forcing a laugh. "He's your brother. We've just spent a lot of time together since he moved here." Her answer was plausible, but the flicker of panic in her eyes betrayed her. James didn't press further, but the suspicion that had been growing inside him solidified into certainty. That night, as Sarah slept, James stayed awake, staring at the ceiling. The illusion of their perfect life was crumbling, and he was helpless to stop it. The next few days passed in a haze for James. His once familiar world felt alien. Conversations with Sarah were strained, the warmth in her voice now ringing hollow. Nathan, who used to visit often, had grown more sporadic, as though sensing the shift. One evening, James left work early, driven by a gnawing need to confirm what he feared. Sarah wasn't expecting him home until late, giving him the perfect opportunity to investigate further. He didn't want to snoop, but he also couldn't ignore the gut feeling that something was amiss. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed Nathan's car parked a few spaces down the street. His pulse quickened. Quietly, he entered the house, the faint hum of music drifting from the living room. He moved silently through the hall, and as he reached the doorway, he froze. There they were, Sarah and Nathan. On the couch, their bodies close, heads tilted together in a way that left no room for ambiguity. Sarah's hand rested on Nathan's leg, their laughter low and intimate. James' world tilted on its axis. The betrayal was undeniable. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, his mind a whirlwind of emotions: shock, anger, heartbreak. "Really?" James said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. Sarah and Nathan sprang apart, their faces a mask of shock and guilt. "James, it's not what it looks like," Sarah stammered, rising to her feet. James let out a bitter laugh. "Not what it looks like? How long has this been going on?" Nathan stood, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "James, let's talk about this." "Don't," James snapped, his voice cold. "You're my brother, Nathan. My own brother." Sarah reached for him, but James stepped back, shaking his head. "Don't touch me." The weight of their betrayal pressed down on him, suffocating. He didn't wait for explanations or excuses. Turning on his heel, he walked out of the house, leaving their panicked voices behind. As James drove aimlessly through the night, his mind reeled with the shattering truth. The life he thought he knew was over, replaced by a cold, painful reality. But even in the depths of his despair, a new thought emerged, a resolve to take back control, to make them feel even a fraction of the pain they had inflicted on him. Revenge wasn't just an idea anymore, it was a plan. James spent the night driving through the empty streets, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger, betrayal, and grief. By the time the first light of dawn touched the horizon, a hardened resolve had taken root within him. The pain Sarah and Nathan had caused was too great to let go unaddressed. Returning home that morning, James found the house silent. Sarah was still asleep, but the weight of the previous night lingered in the air like a storm that had yet to pass. James sat at the dining table, staring at his phone, debating whether to call someone for advice. But the more he thought about it, The more he realized he didn't need anyone to tell him what he already knew. He needed to act. His opportunity came sooner than expected. Later that day, Sarah tried to approach him, her demeanor pleading. "James, please," she began, her voice trembling. "Let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," James said coldly. "You made your choice." Tears welled up in her eyes. "It was a mistake. A stupid, horrible mistake. I'll do anything to fix this." James stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with chilling calm, he said, "Anything?" She nodded fervently, a glimmer of hope crossing her face. "Good," James replied. "We'll see about that." From that moment, James began playing the part of the wronged but forgiving husband. He told Sarah they could work on rebuilding trust, though he knew it was a facade. In truth, he had already begun plotting his revenge. Sarah's younger sister, Emily, had always been supportive of James throughout their marriage. She often confided in him about her struggles, and they shared a genuine bond of friendship. James knew involving her would be risky, but the idea of turning the tables was too tempting to ignore. Over the next few days, James reached out to Emily under the guise of seeking advice about Sarah. "I just don't know what to do," he told her during a phone call, his voice heavy with emotion. "She swears it was a mistake, but how can I trust her again?" Emily, unaware of James' true intentions, was empathetic. "I'm so sorry, James. Sarah made a terrible mistake, but she does love you. I can see it." James played along, slowly building a deeper connection with Emily, his plan quietly taking shape. As days turned into weeks, James found himself at the center of a delicate balancing act, maintaining the illusion of reconciliation with Sarah while deepening his bond with Emily. Each step brought him closer to his ultimate goal, making Sarah and Nathan feel the weight of betrayal. The turning point had arrived, and James was ready to execute his plan. James' act of reconciliation with Sarah unfolded flawlessly. She was desperate to believe in his forgiveness, clinging to the hope that their marriage could be salvaged. Meanwhile, Nathan had gone radio silent, seemingly consumed with guilt or fear of confrontation. James used this silence to his advantage. He reached out to Emily more frequently, their conversations becoming increasingly personal. Each exchange built a bridge of trust, one that Emily, unaware of James' deeper motives, crossed willingly. One evening, James suggested they meet in person. "I need someone to talk to," he said, his voice heavy with weariness. "I don't know how much more of this I can handle alone." Emily agreed without hesitation. They met at a quiet cafe, the dim lighting creating an atmosphere of intimacy. Over coffee, James opened up about his feelings of betrayal and isolation. Emily listened intently, her sympathy evident in her tearful eyes. "You don't deserve this, James," she said softly. "You've always been good to her, to all of us." James leaned forward, his voice low. "Sometimes I wonder if there's even a way to move past this. But talking to you it helps. More than you know." Emily blushed at the compliment, but quickly masked it with a smile. "I'm glad I can be here for you." Their meeting ended with a warm hug, one that lingered just a moment too long. James could see the flicker of confusion and intrigue in Emily's eyes as they parted. The seed had been planted. Back at home, Sarah noticed the change in James. He seemed calmer, less distant, and even affectionate at times. She clung to these moments, desperate for any sign that he was truly forgiving her. But James wasn't forgiving. He was plotting. His next move came a week later when he invited Emily over for dinner under the pretense of discussing Sarah. Sarah was at work, and Nathan hadn't dared to show his face in weeks. It was the perfect opportunity. Emily arrived, her concern for James evident as she stepped into the house. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, setting down a bottle of wine she'd brought. "I'm better now that you're here," James said, his tone warm but measured. The evening passed in a blur of conversation and shared memories. As the night deepened, James made his move, carefully steering the conversation toward his feelings of abandonment and longing. "You've always been there for me, Emily," he said, his voice soft, "even when Sarah wasn't." Emily hesitated, her cheeks flushing. "James, I don't know what to say." "Say you understand," he replied, leaning closer. In that moment, James knew he had set the trap. Whether Emily would fall into it remained to be seen, but the pieces were falling into place. His plan to turn the tables was nearly complete. Emily's hesitation lingered for only a moment before she offered a shy smile, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I understand, James," she said quietly. Her response was all James needed. He closed the distance between them, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "You've been my anchor through all of this," he said, his voice low and deliberate. Emily's breath hitched, and though she seemed torn, she didn't pull away. Instead, she whispered, "I don't want to hurt anyone." "You're not," James assured her, his tone laced with intention. "You're helping me heal." The air between them was charged, and in a moment of weakness, Emily leaned in. Their kiss was tentative at first, a crossing of a line neither could take back. For James, it wasn't love or passion. It was calculated, a step in his plan to dismantle the false sense of security Sarah had tried to rebuild. The evening spiraled into something neither of them could undo. When Emily left later that night, she looked conflicted but not regretful. "Are you sure about this?" she asked as she stood in the doorway. James nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "I've never been more sure." After she left, James sat in the living room, the weight of his actions settling over him. He had crossed a line, but it was a deliberate move in the game Sarah had started. The next morning, James acted as though nothing had happened. Sarah greeted him with a warm smile, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. "How about dinner tonight?" she suggested, trying to recapture the intimacy they once shared. James agreed, hiding the flicker of satisfaction that came with knowing he held the upper hand. As the days passed, he continued to see Emily, carefully balancing his encounters with her while maintaining the illusion of reconciliation with Sarah. Every step brought him closer to the moment when he would reveal the full extent of his revenge, ensuring both Sarah and Nathan would feel the sting of betrayal. James was no longer the victim. He was in control, and soon, everyone would know it. James spent the following weeks perfecting his plan. Emily grew more attached, though she seemed torn by guilt at times. James reassured her with sweet words and gestures, always framing their relationship as something pure and healing. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to cling to the illusion that they were rebuilding their marriage. The stage was set. James chose a quiet Sunday evening for his final move, ensuring both Sarah and Nathan would be present. He sent Sarah a text earlier in the day. "Let's have a family dinner tonight. Just us and Nathan. It's time we cleared the air." Sarah replied quickly, her tone hopeful. "That sounds perfect. I'll make something special." By the time dinner rolled around, the house was filled with the comforting aromas of Sarah's cooking. Nathan arrived, his demeanor sheepish but determined to play along with the facade of normalcy. James kept the conversation light at first, allowing everyone to settle into a false sense of security. Then, as the meal neared its end, he dropped the first bombshell. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," James began, setting his fork down. His tone was calm, almost casual, about trust, loyalty, and the choices we make. Sarah and Nathan exchanged uneasy glances. "I've also had time to reflect on betrayal," James continued, his gaze locking onto Nathan. "It's a funny thing, isn't it? How the people closest to us can cause the deepest wounds." Sarah's face paled. "James," she began, but he cut her off with a raised hand. "Let me finish," he said, his voice firm but steady. "I caught the two of you. I know everything." The room fell into stunned silence. Nathan looked down, his face flushed with guilt, while Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "James, Sarah stammered, but James wasn't done. "Save it," he said coldly. Then, turning to Nathan, he added, "And you, my own brother, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Nathan opened his mouth, but no words came. James leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You both thought you could betray me and walk away unscathed. But here's the thing about betrayal. It cuts both ways." Before either of them could respond, James delivered the final blow. "I've been spending a lot of time with Emily," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "She's been very supportive." Sarah's face crumpled as realization dawned. "Emily? My sister?" "Yes," James said simply. She knows how to treat someone with respect. The room erupted into chaos. Sarah's sobs mixed with Nathan's protests, but James remained calm, watching as the betrayal came full circle. He stood, his voice cutting through the noise. You both destroyed this family. Now you can live with the consequences. Without another word, James walked out, leaving Sarah and Nathan to grapple with the wreckage. His heart was heavy, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of closure. The balance had been restored, and the truth was finally out. In the days following the explosive dinner, James packed his things and moved into a small rental apartment across town. The echoes of that night, the tears, the shouts, the betrayal, still reverberated in his mind, but he felt lighter with each passing day. Sarah reached out repeatedly, begging for forgiveness, but James ignored her calls and messages. Nathan, too, attempted to mend the bridge he had burned, but James knew their relationship would never recover. Emily was a different story. She sent a single, heartfelt message. James, I'm so sorry for everything. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I hope you find peace. James didn't reply. He knew Emily had been caught in a web of manipulation, one he had spun with careful intent. He felt a pang of guilt for using her, but his focus now was on rebuilding his life, not dwelling on the wreckage. The divorce from Sarah proceeded quickly. Armed with the truth of her infidelity and clear evidence of Nathan's involvement, James ensured the process was as swift and equitable as possible. By the time the papers were finalized, he felt free for the first time in years. He threw himself into work, finding solace in the creativity of his architectural projects. On weekends, he explored hobbies he had long neglected, hiking, photography, and even taking up guitar lessons. Each new experience was a step toward reclaiming his identity. Though he had no plans to reconnect with Sarah or Nathan, he didn't wish them ill. Time would deal its own lessons to them, and he no longer felt responsible for their choices. Months later, James found himself sitting in a cafe, sketching designs for a new project. A woman at the next table struck up a conversation, curious about his work. She had a kind smile and an infectious laugh, and for the first time in a long while, James felt something stir within him, hope. As they exchanged numbers and made tentative plans to meet again, James realized that his journey wasn't over. Life had dealt him a painful hand, but it hadn't defeated him. He had faced betrayal and heartbreak, but now, James was ready to move forward, wiser, stronger, and open to the possibilities of a new chapter.